Well, good evening.
Good evening.
It is good to be here. As Brother Bob said, I am married to Regina, John and Wanda's daughter. And if you're new here, like in the last 7 years, because that's when we left, this is actually kind of where it started. I met Regina, and she had the, I guess, what is it, something. No sense. That was it. So I asked her out, and she said yes, and then she introduced me to the church, and the men here took me under their wing, and they were able to encourage me and show me the scriptures, and something I had read the Bible myself on my own, but like many in the world, it's kind of hard sometimes, the Ethiopian, unless someone guides you. And so had a great man by the name of Bill Norton. I know most of you know Bill Norton. And he'd come over to my house and study with me. So it just went from there. So I'm very appreciative of the elders here for inviting me tonight, and for the congregation, because you've all have inspired me and encouraged me. Some of you even supported me while I was going through preaching school. And so I'm glad to be here this evening. As Brother Bob said, the lesson tonight is the 4 views or different views of the book of Revelation. And it's very interesting as you start looking at the book of Revelation, and you look to the world and you do a Google search, just a quick internet search, and you're going to find all kinds of thoughts and ideas on the book of Revelation. And so I had taught this 2015. I had taught this on a Wednesday night series. We just did the book of Revelation, and I actually had some members come to me, and they were apprehensive about studying the book. Some of them said to me, well, that's a scary book. Or, I've read that before, and I don't really understand it. And so some people actually did not attend the Wednesday night lessons when we were studying the book of Revelation. But after it was all said and done, those who did, we had just opened the Bible like we would with any book of the Bible, and we started studying it. When we left out, I purposely did not do the different views of the book of Revelation when we started. I just did it like I would do one of the other books of the Bible. And afterwards, people were like, well, you know what? That's not as bad as I imagined. And they were like, that's not what I thought was in there. Because they had come before looking to the book of Revelation with denominational baggage. They had come with the things they had seen in the world through literature and movies like the Left Behind series. And they thought that those things that they saw were actually in the book of Revelation. And as we studied it, several of them said to me, well, that wasn't in there. I was expecting to find, and whatever it happened to be in it wasn't there. And so several said to me that that's not what they had been told in the past, meaning what they had heard. And that's one of the most dangerous things, is what we have heard. Jesus many times said, you have heard it said, but I say. And we have to make sure that we're doing our own diligent study, and we're not relying just on what we've heard. And so some people, they get scared because of the figurative language. They get confused by it sometimes because they bring in some of that outside baggage. Some are actually turned off by the book of Revelation. And some are even intimidated by it. And so they just don't. John writes, he says, I, John, both your brother and companion. And notice what he says, in the tribulation and kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ. And he says, I was on the island called Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. So he's serving exile there for the gospel. But he says at that time that he was in the tribulation. There are some that we're going to look at, they teach that there is a coming tribulation. And he says that he was in it. There are some that are going to teach that Christ needs to return a second or a third or even a fourth time to establish his kingdom. And yet John says right here at the beginning that he was in the kingdom. And then this chapter, as we looked at chapter 1, he bookends this, because when we get to Revelation 22, and if you flip there to the end of the book of Revelation, and I know we're going to be mostly in chapter 1, but there's a few others. But here in Revelation 22, in verse 6, as John gets ready to close this epistle, and that's what it is, it's an epistle, he says, then he said to me, these words are faithful and true, and the Lord God of the holy prophets sent his angels to show his servants the things which must shortly take place. And so he's telling us that. These things are soon to be. And Revelation was a message for those who heard it in the day in which John was writing it. An audience that John was writing to. And so just like other books, it was intended for a particular audience, for a particular purpose. And so when we read any of the books of the New Testament, or even in the Old Testament, when we look to it, but I think of the epistles through the New Testament, it's addressed to a certain congregation or to an individual. And it was written to them for a reason. And it was addressing some issue that was happening at that time, or something that needed to be addressed, or some teaching that needed to be taught. And so there is also an application for us today as we look to it. And so we have to remember that. And we're not going to cover everything tonight. And this series that you've put on here at Orange Street is so great. In fact, I was sharing it with a friend today, and over in Sarasota, and he's like, I'm going to live stream, or I'm going to tune in later and catch the recording. And he looked and he said, man, those are some great topics. And they are. And there's some great speakers too. So I'll look forward to more of this. But as we look to this, it's a letter, again, with the obvious recipient. It contains a greeting. And it's also prophecy. God has inspired John through Jesus, through the angel, the Holy Spirit, to John, to write this down for not just those of the first century, those who were receiving the letter, but so that we could learn from it as well. And when we look to prophecy, God has his spokesman. And whether it's proclaiming his word, whether it's the commandments that he gives, whether the instructions, some type of guidance, whether it's prediction, he's given it to us for a purpose. And those writers, they didn't write of their own accord. We were told that in the Bible, that no scripture is of any private interpretation. They didn't sit down and say, well, I think God meant this when he told me that. Or, I think this should be written this way. God used those writers, and he used their talents and their specific talents and whatever experiences they had, but what they wrote was what he wanted written. And so there was also apocalyptic literature. And one of those things that when we look to, we have to understand that was a typical Hebrew way of writing. They would use this apocalyptic literature, and we see it in the Old Testament, such as the book of Daniel, which some of Revelation draws from it. And those who look to Revelation with their different views, they draw from things like the book of Daniel, of Ezekiel, and such. But the book is, in the Greek, if I get this right, apocalypsis, and it's a Jewish writing style. It uses symbols and figurative language, and the meaning is a disclosure, or an appearing, a coming, a lighting, a manifestation, to be revealed, a revelation. And we think about, if you've ever read a mystery novel or watched a mystery show on TV, who likes to get to the end of the book or the end of the show and they don't reveal who the killer was, who done it? That's no fun, is it? And so when we think of Revelation, there are things being revealed. And so we look to it as how it was written to those who received it. And much different than what we would think when we view it, just as I said, those people that, when I originally presented just the book of Revelation, there's a very different aspect when we think of apocalypse and apocalypsis. Because if you talk to the world and you think of apocalypse, they think of something that is a universal, widespread destruction. And so that's what they have in their mind, a disaster. And that's what gives way to some of the false teachings. And so, again, tonight we're not going to view everything, obviously, in one evening, but I want to present a couple of views that are the common views. And from there, as the other speakers speak, you'll have something to look to what they're saying and see where some of the ideas come from. So the first view we're going to look at is what's called the preterist view. And this is a view that says that the entire book, that it tells only what happened to the church in the early day of the church under the rule of the Roman Empire. And they see the Pope and Catholicism as the Antichrist. And so that's part of this view. Preterism, it comes from the Latin praetor. It means past. And so preterism is the view that these biblical prophecies concerning the end times, that they have already been fulfilled in some time in the past, not long after John was writing on the island of Patmos. Now, the preterist, he sees these future fulfillments of John's prophecies, as John speaks of a future sense. He sees them as future for John, but in the past for us. And the reason that they take for this is trying to make Revelation into an early date. And an early date, what I mean is pre-70 AD. And so they want everything to be pre-70 AD. And the reason for this is they have a purpose. It needs to fall into that pre-70 AD. But John's writing, it's to a very specific purpose. And they see John's writings to be toward the destruction of Jerusalem. And the preterist movement, essentially, it teaches that all the end time prophecies that we read of, those were all fulfilled prior to AD 70 or at AD 70. And they look at that because that is when the Romans attacked Jerusalem, and Jerusalem fell under the siege, the temple was destroyed. And so they teach that every event that normally is associated with the end times and Christ's second coming, the tribulation, the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, it's already happened. And this is one that always gets me, and I know one of the speakers is doing the AD 70, and a gentleman by the name of Max King, he really promoted that a lot. And so I know there will be a speaker speaking on that, but it's an interesting study. I've never understood it, because if everything happened in AD 70, why are we still here?
Amen.
And what is the hope? But in any case, the final judgment they see is actually still in the process of being fulfilled, because they still look to Jesus' return. What they do is they say that Jesus' first, or what would be second coming, has already happened, but it was spiritual. He didn't come in the flesh. And so there's another view on that. But preterists, they have two views even among themselves, because they can't agree. And that's one of the things, as I was looking to these different views, there's always a little subsection of whatever view it is. And then, of course, there's several views that we won't even look at tonight because we just don't have the time. But you have the full preterist. The full preterist, he sees all the prophecies that we read of in Revelation, they were fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's all done. Everything's happened. And he sees the end time events such as Christ's second coming, the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment to come. They've already occurred. And we're now living in the eternal state of the new heavens and the new earth. How do y'all like the new heaven and the new earth?
Not good enough.
I was promised there'd be no more pain, no more tears, no more suffering. I don't know. But they take Matthew 16, verse 28, and they take Matthew 24, verse 34, and they use this to support this view. And here's where Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And then Matthew 24, verse 34, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." And so they look to that and all this has to take place before those that are here die. And so it's going to be in their lifetime. They see generation as being 40 years. That's the view of a generation. And they also use Josephus. He was a historian, but he wrote of the fall of Jerusalem. And some of the things he writes of, they seem to mirror the symbolism of Revelation. And so I haven't done a full study on Josephus's work. I don't know if you've ever really looked in depth at Josephus's work. Yeah, but I have to wonder sometimes how much he might have been influenced by the Christianity. So when he wrote, but partial preterists believe that most of the prophecies of Revelation have already occurred and were fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. However, they feel that Revelation chapters 20 through 22 are still to be fulfilled in some future time with the resurrection of the believers and the return of Christ and then the final judgment. So in this, they are in disagreement with the full preterist. So even within the preterist view, that there's a disagreement. And that's because, of course, the full preterist, he denies the second coming, the judgment, the resurrection of the dead. So, of course, there are some problems with the preterist view when we look at it. Some are probably obvious already, but this being that the events of Matthew 24, and I know one of the speakers has got, I think it might be Daniel has Matthew 24, but they don't really harmonize with Revelation chapter 4 through 19. And so they differ in several ways. And one way is the way in which Jesus is described in his return to Jerusalem. In Matthew 24, verse 27, it says, "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." And so in the preterist view, this is the Roman army's attack on Jerusalem. But the problem is, they came from the west. And the siege wasn't like lightning strike. It was several years drawn out, and they were in siege of Jerusalem. And then also, that time was General Titus. He destroyed and he burned the temple. But in Matthew 24, verse 15, it talks about the abomination of desolation. And this is probably better seen at another time with a person by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And if you read Maccabees, he's in there, he's in Josephus' Antiquities. But he built a pagan altar over the altar of burnt offerings, and he offered swine on it. And he required the Jews every day to come and offer swine on the altar. And so that better fits the abomination of desolation and that desecration of the temple. One of the main problems of the preterist view, it denies the victory of Christ. If Christ was not all victorious in his time when he died upon the cross, then the preterist view, they actually belittle his death on the cross. Because they're saying he has to come again, and possibly even a third time, and a fourth time. And so it just goes on. The argument they present is that John does not mention the destruction of Jerusalem. And so since that's not mentioned in the book of Revelation, well, they say, well, it must not have happened yet. And so John doesn't write of this destruction. But the problem is, John was writing to a particular audience again. And then, of course, they use also that he was told to measure the temple in Revelation 11, verse 1. And so they say, well, if he was told to measure the temple and to count the worshipers, well, then it was still there. And so they take this pre-70 date. But the fact is, John was writing to a mostly Gentile audience. What would the destruction of Jerusalem really mean to them? And it was 25 years after, if you take the later date. So against the preterist is the futurist. And the futurists hold that the events of the book of Revelation simply did not occur at AD 70. For example, in AD 70, a third of mankind was not killed, as they say was predicted in Revelation 9 and verse 18. So they say it can't be. Nor was every living creature in the sea dead, as predicted in Revelation 9 and verse 8, or I'm sorry, Revelation 16 verse 3. So in order to explain these texts, the preterists must resort to an allegorical interpretation, since obviously these things didn't happen at the time they're trying to say they happened, and so they use it. Well, it's just allegorical. It's just a way of interpreting. And so some of this, as I said, I know it's going to be covered by other speakers throughout the series. I've got Brother Kenny and Brother Kemp I wrote in here, so some of those will be viewed. Now, this futurist view, this view says that the book describes events in the distant future from when it was actually written. So they're looking sometime in the future, far in the future, these events in Revelation will occur. And they argue a very literal and plain interpretation of Revelation. And so when you're dealing with a book with symbols and visions and things of that nature, figurative language, you start to try and say, well, it's all literal. You can see where you're going to come into problems. And they apply the rules of grammar to attempt to stay within the context of writing and actual historical events. And the belief is also that the symbolic and figurative language, that it can be understood by interpreting it thus using the laws of language and using it in a literal sense. And I'm not sure exactly, as you think about some of the figurative language, to try and turn that into a literal item and a literal meaning, but they don't deny the figurative language and the symbolism that's in the book of Revelation. They just simply say that these prophecies, they can be interpreted normally by viewing the meaning of these visions and not the purpose behind them, but the vision itself in some type of a literal sense. And so the idea they have is the figurative makes the meaning clearer, but it is the literal meaning that the reader should grasp. And so there are certain things, if you take literal a beast riding out of the sea, well, your mind is to grasp that it's an actual literal beast rising out of the sea. And so it loses the figurative sense that John had intended behind it. Futurism teaches that the majority of prophecy contained in Revelation has not been fulfilled and still awaits a literal fulfillment. And again, they still stick with that literal interpretation. The futurist essentially asserts that everything after Revelation chapter 4 happens in a very brief period of time at Christ's return. And so some of the things that we look at is if you actually, as you get into these lessons, some of what they say in these views almost ring true. Some of them are very close sometimes to being what is actually being said. But there's always a slight twist on it. The book is divided then by the futurists into 3 divisions. And they take this from Revelation 1 in verse 19. And here John writes, and it's actually Jesus speaking, he's recording, and it says, "Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this." And so the futurist sees these as 3 categories, 3 events. And so they divide up chapter 1 to be what you have seen, chapters 2 and 3 describing the present, the things that are, and then everything from chapter 4 to the end of the book, the things which will take place. And so they're all future. Futurists, again, they use this very literal approach in interpreting Revelation. And again, they hold chapters 4 through 19 refer to a 7-year period known as the tribulation. And that's where we start to get some of these ideas in. And they say it corresponds with Daniel's prophecy. When we look at Daniel 9, in verse 27, Daniel says, "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consumption which is determined is poured out on the desolate." And so again, they're taking these as literal weeks. And so within this short time frame is when they're saying everything will happen. The teaching also holds that during the time of God's judgments, that they're poured out on mankind. They see the seals, the trumpets, the bowls that are depicted in Revelation. Chapter 13 is then viewed as a literal description of future political and religious leaders that are being depicted as the 2 beasts, which is kind of interesting when they take this strictly literal view, but now they admit these 2 beasts, they're not actual beasts, but they see them as these religious and political leaders. In chapter 17, the harlot is seen as representing the apostate church. Again, kind of goes away from that literal interpretation. The second coming of Jesus and the Battle of Armageddon are seen in chapter 19, but are followed by a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth in chapter 20. And so they see Jesus coming in the second coming, but setting up this earthly kingdom, reigning for 1,000 years, and then, of course, the time of tribulation, and there's a couple of different views that we'll look at in a minute. But the final chapters are then events that follow with the creation of the new heavens and the new earth, with a heavenly city, which is described by John when we get to Revelation 21 and verse 10. And in Revelation 21 verse 10, he says he saw the holy city, he says the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. And so they see that time is, again, this future when Christ is going to set up this earthly kingdom. Also part of the futurist view, and as I said, we're going to get to this in a second, this tribulation, but there's what's called dispensationalism and premillennialism. And dispensationalists, they are basically premillennialists who affirm a future literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus, according to Revelation 20, verse 6, they say. And they merge that with and continues with the eternal state of the new heavens and the new earth. And then the premillennialist, he holds that Jesus' physical return to earth will occur prior to the millennium, and uses a literal interpretation of Revelation 20, 1 through 6, which they say describes Jesus' 1,000-year reign. And so there's some different thoughts on this. The rapture goes into this, the Antichrist goes into this, and the physical kingdom. And so they see all these things within that time frame when Jesus returns. Now, the futurists claim that the literal interpretation method of Revelation originated with early Christians, and they cite people such as Clement of Rome from AD 96, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others. And so they say, we go back to these early, what they call church fathers sometimes, and well, they held this view, so it must be right. And this view is widely popular today, and it's being taught in places such as the Dallas Theological Seminary, the Moody Bible Institute, and it is popular with many Christians throughout the world. However, many try to take the events and symbols of Revelation and they try to apply them to events happening today. And so there's some problems with that, because guess what happens in every generation who reads Revelation? They're trying to apply the events to the things happening in their day. And so some have even tried to predict the date of Christ's return. Writings such as, again, the Left Behind series that pictures this idea of a rapture. And there's a lot of things I know, I can't remember which brother is speaking on the rapture, but you'll see things that they just don't fit. This idea of some people are raptured up, some people are left behind, and people are left wondering what happened. And yet, when we read the Bible, we really realize, when Jesus comes, it's going to be with a shout of a trumpet, and all those things, the angels, and it's not some mysterious, thing that happens. Every eye will see him, every tongue will confess, and every knee shall bow. And so no one's going to be left behind wondering what happened. This view also believes in an individual who's going to appear on the world stage to usurp the place of Jesus Christ as the head of the church, and of course described as the Antichrist, which is not consistent with John's other writings. We look to the epistles of John, such as 1 John and 2 John, and he clearly tells us in those books, or those short epistles, who the Antichrist is. He says there were many of them. They existed in his day. They had already gone out into the world. And he says there anyone who denies that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. And so he tells us very clearly it's not an individual, but it's an attitude that exists within many, that they deny Christ and they are liars and deceivers, he says. And so they will, you want to write down 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18. So 1 John 2, verse 18. Got a typo in here, but it should be 1 John 4, verse 3. And so 1 John 4, verse 3, and it's supposed to be 1 John 2. There's supposed to be 2 verses there. I can't remember what the other one is. And then 2 John 1, 7. Yeah, I think I left a number off.
Again, one time.
22.
22. So 1 John 2, 22. So 1 John 2, 18, and then 1 John 2, 22. That's why I left the 2 off. Then 1 John 4, verse 3, and 2 John 1, verse 7. And those verses clearly tell who the Antichrist is. And so those verses in themselves, they destroy that whole idea of a single individual that's going to come to power and usurp this authority. Again, the idea creates also this idea of a 7-year tribulation, that Christ returning either in the middle of that 7 years and rapturing some up, or returning sometimes at the beginning and then again at the end, which creates a second and a third coming of Christ. And of course, the Bible only ever speaks of a second coming of Christ. And again, we go back to Revelation 1 and verse 9, and this destroys this thought, because John says that he was their companion then, at the time of writing, in the tribulation. And so it's kind of hard to have a future time of tribulation when you're already in tribulation. I don't know, maybe things just get worse. We get a second tribulation on top of the first tribulation. But this is also where the false idea, again, of the rapture comes from. The apocalyptic nature of the writing has caused many to misinterpret the symbols and make figurative literal and literal figurative. The futurist view also makes the book of Revelation irrelevant to those who John was writing of. Because if everything's going to happen in some future time, and, when we look at it, there are some things when we read the book of Revelation, if we get to the last chapters, there are some things that are future. But if the whole point of the whole book is things are going to happen some distant future time, and I'm receiving this letter from John, and I'm reading it, well, what good does that do me? What comfort does it bring me? What hope does it bring me? And so again, we have to remember the time in which John is writing, and he's writing to people of his day for the purpose of giving them comfort through the tribulation that's beginning and that is coming. John himself already suffering for the preaching of the gospel. And then, of course, when we get into the book of Acts, which is another time frame, but we see that they were being scattered everywhere. That there was persecution. Even Saul of Tarsus, as he held the coat so that they could stone Stephen. So things were already happening. Futurists and preterists are opposed to one another. So it's something to keep them, if you want to think about that, they are opposed to one another, the futurists and the preterists. As much of the interpretation relies on the date of the writing of Revelation. For the preterist, it has to be pre-AD 70. For the futurist, it's after AD 70. And usually they take the time of AD 96. And there's a reason for this. They hold the fulfillment of Revelation and the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the preterist. But the futurist, with this 96 AD, is because the writings of Irenaeus. Now, he stated in his works, it's called Against Heresies, he says that John wrote Revelation at the end of the Emperor Domitian's reign. Well, we can go to secular history, and we know that Domitian reigned from 81 to 96. Even if we take the early date and say, well, John wrote at the beginning of Domitian's reign, that's 81, it's still 11 years too late to be helpful to the preterist. John also, or Irenaeus rather, he lived from 130 to 202, but he was a disciple of Polycarp, and tradition holds Polycarp was a disciple of John. Polycarp lived from 69 to 155, and so the teaching is that Irenaeus got his information from Polycarp, who was a direct link to to John. And when we look at Polycarp being 69 to 155, I don't think at 1 year old or less that there was something happening that there was a very short time frame for what was going to happen. But also the conditions of the seven churches of Revelation. When we look to the churches that John is writing to, these seem more a second generation church than a first generation church. There's a couple of things we can see. The church of Ephesus, Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, they're charged with abandoning their first love. And they're warned of the Nicolaitan heresy. Now, if John wrote Revelation in AD 65 or sometime around that time, before AD 70, it would have overlapped with Paul's letter to the Ephesians and to Timothy. And so how can he be writing to them at one point, and the Ephesians had a good, favorable report, but then later you left your first love, and this would overlap. How can it be one and the same? Paul makes no mention of either the loss of the first love or the threat of the Nicolaitans when he writes. So what is it, the 5-minute buzzer? Yeah. Futurists also answer the preterist accusation of John not writing of the destruction of Jerusalem, again, because he doesn't mention it, but again, 25 years later, he's writing to a mostly Gentile audience of Asia. And so much of this, again, is going to be covered with other speakers. And we won't get into the last two views. There's the spiritual view or symbolist view, and then there's the historical view. So we just got a minute. So quickly, the symbolic spiritual, they see the entire book in its prophetic nature as symbolic of the conflict between good and evil. It was introduced by Origen, AD 185 to 254, made prominent by Augustine from 354 to 420 was his lifetime. So it gives you the kind of the time that they were writing several hundred years after the apostles. And so the book of Revelation is viewed as a story that can be interpreted by revealing a hidden message typically one with a moral or a political meaning to it. And so they have a variety of approaches they look at, and we won't get into all of those. But then the historical view. This view sees the book as a blueprint of history. And this view feels that the prophecies have been and still are being fulfilled. And the historical view teaches Revelation as a symbolic representation with events having already happened for the most part. The view was endorsed by many of the Reformation movement during the Reformation, 1700s. Still part of the denominational world today teaches us, and this is the dispensational and the premillennial views. There are gentlemen, some of the ones we've recognized, probably names from history: Wycliffe, Tyndale, Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, and Wesley. They all held to this view. We see Christians under severe persecution, and the message is one of hope and to comfort them in time of suffering. And so this views the first 3 chapters as 7 periods of church history as they look at the 7 churches of Asia. And then it goes on from there. Go back here real quickly. While the spiritual view, go back to that one for a minute, while it avoids the problem some have in harmonizing the passages we see with these events in history, it makes it applicable and relevant to those throughout history. So we just kind of ignore some of the things that don't harmonize because it's spiritual. And so you can take away from it whatever you want in any time frame. But it denies the book of Revelation to have any specific fulfillment, and also takes away any of the comfort that would have been to the early Christians. And then in the historical interpretation, there's several criticisms on this view, but those who hold the historical view tend to interpret the book in the context of the period in which they're living in. And so again, try to take and look to the newspapers, look to modern things that are happening, place it within this view. And they tend to see the climax of Revelation happening in their generation. And so we see some of the people that have been predicting the coming of Christ, it's in our time. And there's been several that they've given a date. Of course, when the date doesn't happen, and Christ doesn't return on that date, they modify their date. There are some groups that have actually given up trying to interpret when Jesus is going to return because they've been wrong so many times. And so they just quit. This view also focuses mostly on the events in the church in Western Europe. And it doesn't go much beyond that. It doesn't encompass the rest of the world because it's looking at this past historical time. And so this view doesn't allow for those events outside the area. Also, like the futurist view, it fails to properly identify the Antichrist. Because once again, they're looking at it as a specific individual, and John clearly tells us who that is. And so I think your lesson goes more into some of that. But that pretty much sums it up. As you get out there and you look, there's a lot of different views, and this is something that I have come to find out, and it's probably been said many times, but it always bears repeating. Nothing beats personal study. It is great, and you should be here for the sermons, for the Bible classes, for any of the other things, but nothing takes the place of that personal study. You'll get more out of it. Thank you.
Thank you.